The member for Oshawa.
Thank you, Speaker. And it is always my privilege to stand in this fine legislature and speak on behalf of my constituents in Oshawa. And today I finally have the chance to speak about this Liberal government's budget. It is a beautifully titled budget, Mr. Speaker. It's called Jobs for Today and Tomorrow, which is a very hopeful title. However, as I've learned, sitting across from this Liberal government, the devil's in the details, and a pretty title does not a strong piece of legislation make. If we were going to better name it, it might be fairer to say hardly any jobs today and likely even fewer tomorrow. And this is from me, and I'm an optimist. But, Speaker, with the way this government short-sightedly puts growth in the economy in its crosshairs, it is hard to be hopeful. So let's talk about the budget, and let's first talk about how we got here. Since I'm still relatively new, Mr. Speaker, I still appreciate learning the process. I still appreciate understanding how Ontario's government works, or sometimes how it pretends to be working. So back to the budget. I stand in this legislature on a fairly frequent basis, and I give the government heck from time to time about not being accessible to all Ontarians. We point out when the government shuts down and rushes through debate, when they spring big new bills on the rest of the legislature and hope that we won't have enough time to inform or involve stakeholders. We see that this government's favourite toy is time allocation, which is speeding up the process and shutting down discussion. We know that this government hates to travel ideas and committees around to other parts of the province, like to my community of Oshawa. The Liberals are quick to point out that people in the north or rural communities can just as easily call in, that they don't need to have face-to-face submissions. But I don't think that that's fair. Nor do I think that is as effective as having a real person sit across from their representative government and look them in the eye. But from where I sit, that seems to be what this government wants to avoid, interacting with constituents and answering to them directly. For the average piece of legislation, there doesn't seem to be the interest in travelling to different communities. With the budget, however, there wasn't really any way around it. The Finance Committee travelled to cities around the province and heard from many Ontarians. Well, I decided to sit in on pre-budget committee consultations in Hamilton. I heard from desperate Ontarians hoping that the government would address poverty and social systems. I heard from municipalities with specific requests. I heard from corrections officers imploring the government for necessary health and safety equipment and investment. I heard from Ontarians begging this Wynne government to stop the sell-off of Hydro One. I heard from people talking about our woefully underfunded health care system, and they shared very real examples of how bad things have gotten. Throughout the pre-budget consultations, there were countless submissions, written and in person, and they were honest, and they were raw, and they deserved to be heard. Now, I don't envy anyone who makes decisions around the task of prioritizing such desperate and real needs, but that's the job. There must be careful, conscientious and responsible calculations and considerations when it comes to sorting through all of the needs and requests from across the province. Otherwise, why on earth bother with the committee process? If the decisions have already been made, then why go through the motions of collecting input from Ontarians? So, Mr. Speaker, I sat in for a day on committee. I watched the government members listen. I heard them asking questions for clarification. I heard them thank each presenter, and then they spent the next week or two continuing to hear submissions. Research was compiling and organizing, summarizing and sorting the hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and I'll tell you what I think should have happened next. The committee should have presented its report to the legislature. All of this information should have been taken under advisement, and then the budget should have been updated to reflect some of that input. However, Mr. Speaker, I'm learning that the process that should be often is not what happens when it comes to this Liberal government's interpretation of process. You might recall that the budget was ready almost 2 months before it normally would be, and we keep hearing that again and again. So they were ahead of schedule. In fact, it was so rushed, Speaker, that the Premier has had to backtrack on details, likely because they were so hastily strung together that they can't even withstand criticism. But more on that later. So as I was saying, this budget came out way ahead of schedule. Why? Why the rush? What's the hurry? You know, this budget is pretty important. It's the budget for the government of the province of Ontario. It matters. It has far-reaching implications. The ripple effects of these decisions will affect everyone across the province. So, you would think that it would be worth taking the time to do it right. The budget needed to be written. It needed to be signed off on, translated, and then printed. And that takes a while. In fact, I would challenge this government to prove that the final budget wasn't actually in mid-process while they were sitting across from Ontarians who thought they were being listened to. And I'm sure that they will feign indignation at the very thought, but we do know that the budget was signed, sealed, and delivered before the committee even had finished its report. The voices from across Ontario had their say merely for show. Isn't that awful? And we wonder why people across Ontario are cynical. So, here is our rush budget. The government is so fond of stretch goals. I wish they were afraid of stretch goals. Anyway, so fond of its stretch goals, and this budget is another perfect example. It's got some shiny distractions, but very little substance. Unfortunately, it continues down the path of death by 1,000 cuts, and when it comes to the average Ontarian household, life is just going to be more challenging. In fact, this government is again missing every opportunity to commit to providing the basics that we need across the province. Basics like healthcare, jobs, and education. So let's talk about healthcare. There were rallies outside of every single pre-budget consultation around the province. Organizations and everyday Ontarians were demanding that this government stop slashing and laying to waste our public healthcare system. They were begging for this government to stop cutting healthcare. They were loud and clear about the many ways to strengthen services and healthcare for everyone. Oh, and a side note, Mr. Speaker, this government has denied every day and in every way that they are even cutting services. They play word games and try to out-clever Ontarians with their moving target definition of cuts. If it looks like a cut, and it hurts like a cut, and it bleeds like a cut, and it festers like a cut, this government will play games and say, nope, not a cut. In lib speak, they might be clever and call it a, I don't know, temporary skin displacement, or like a division of dermal continuity. But honestly, a cut is a cut is a cut is a cut. So case in point, in Durham Region, we were the guinea pig when it came to cutting rehabilitation services, occupational therapy and physiotherapy. Non-acute, non-high-risk clients were suddenly no longer able to get at-home rehab services. When we did our digging, sure enough, no more services. But fear not, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a cut. It was a waiting list. Everyone who was eligible for services was now eligible to be on the shiny, newly created waiting list. Previously, they would have received services, but now with new financial constraints, they were put on an indefinite wait list, not cut. So, no services, but not cut. Just put in a box marked, if we win the lottery. Tantamount to a cut, technically deemed waitlisted. Ta-da, Liberal shenanigans. But I digress, Speaker. Healthcare in Ontario is being attacked by this government, and I'd like to see them try to deny that fact. So let's talk about the new ways that's happening. This budget nearly doubles the cost of prescription drugs for most seniors. Doubles for seniors. Targeting seniors. My grandma will be 95 on March 26th. And that's no small feat, Mr. Speaker. She still lives at home and is doing her best. She does need care at home. She needs access to affordable transportation. She needs me to visit more often. She would really appreciate a local grocery delivery service. What she doesn't need or deserve is for the government to pick her up and shake her to see if a few loonies fall out. Making up the difference by fleecing our seniors is unconscionable. You want money coming in? Stop the sell-off of Hydro One, a revenue-generating asset. Stop scrounging in seniors' couch cushions and do something sustainable and think long-term. Healthcare should not be strengthened by a government that doesn't care about health, or cannot be strengthened by a government that doesn't care about health. So I challenge them to actually care and want to make it better. Speaker, I will fight for strong public services, and I will fight until the end for strong, properly funded public education. Came out of the classroom, and I maintain that education is the great equalizer. Every student deserves fair access to opportunity and a quality education. It galls me to no end that in this year alone, the government is slashing $430 million from education. Our kids deserve resourced classrooms and supported staff to facilitate their learning and growth. For perspective, in 3 years, this government will have cut $1.1 billion out of education. So don't just think dollars, think supports, think services, think opportunities, and think future. Speaker, I've been mad at this government for a long time. In fact, it was the Liberals who wrecked so much, so fast with Bill 115, and that's what inspired me to take action. So here I am, and while it feels good to have the opportunity to give them a piece of my mind from time to time, and I'm glad to be able to vote on the record against their short-sighted, damaging budget, it doesn't feel good to know that I can't stop them from pulling the rug out from under our kids. They are hell-bent on underfunding and undermining our system and our students, but it's wrong. It is said that a penny saved is a penny earned, but what about a penny stolen? A penny stolen is one that could have been invested, and investing in our children and our students has value that none of us will ever be able to measure. But here we see, again, a government that is short-changing their opportunities and potential. So shame on the minister and shame on the premier. Speaker, since we're talking about education, you've probably heard that this budget has been strategically marketed as the free tuition budget. So let's discuss. Personally, I know where I stand on education. And let's be clear, New Democrats support easier access to affordable education. Simplifying the student aid system sounds like a good thing. Student groups have been calling for change for years, and we support their work and their gains. But to call this free tuition isn't being entirely honest. Free-ish might be more clear. There are a lot of pieces that need to be addressed by this government so students can budget and make plans. Professional program students don't know where they will stand. And what is the cost, the real cost of tuition? What does this government have to say about tuition caps? In the words of the government speaker, the language around free tuition is, quote, evolving. We hope, Mr. Speaker, that we all have a better understanding of what this government intends. We don't want it to be a clear-ish explanation when we finally get it. Students deserve to know how to plan for their futures. So we know that free-ish tuition is stealing the headlines, but here is something the government isn't talking about when it comes to post-secondary education. On a per-student basis, Ontario's universities receive the lowest level of public funding in all of Canada. Ontario has now ranked last on per-student funding in Canada for 6 consecutive years. Also, tuition fees are the highest in Canada. So not only do we want students to have access to affordable education, we want them to know that it is quality education delivered by qualified and fairly compensated faculty. We want students to be able to afford a high-quality education. You know what else, Mr. Speaker? We want them to graduate into a promising and optimistic employment landscape. But for 12 years straight, Ontario's youth unemployment rate has sat above the national rate. In Oshawa, as in Windsor, our youth unemployment rate is among the highest in the province and in the country. Why don't we see anything addressing that in this rush budget? What we do see in regards to jobs and the economy is the fact that the Liberals project that they will fail to meet last year's job creation goals by more than 60,000 jobs. So I just want to take a moment to point out that they can't even meet a target that they set. They made up the number and they can't even reach it. So I guess we're back to stretch goals. But this government's inability to get it right, or even right-ish, when it comes to job creation and employment has very real consequences in very real communities. Those 60,000 jobs would fill 10 GM centres. That's a lot of people, with families and plans to make. In 2015, Oshawa was among the top 10 cities with the highest unemployment rate in the country every single month except for one. Those are real people and real families that we are talking about. And Speaker, it was really disappointing that any attention to automotive in this budget was almost an afterthought. This budget laid out automotive as a bottom-rung priority, and we don't accept this. We need to see a comprehensive and properly designed manufacturing and automotive strategy that will strengthen opportunities in our communities. They're dropping the ball and in the process endangering our futures. Speaker, we know I wear a few hats in this role, one of which is the NDP critic for pensions. When our budgets were delivered to us in the legislature on Budget Day, I immediately turned to the section on pensions. Ontarians are eagerly waiting to know the details of the ORPP as this government decides them. So a bit of background. 2/3 of Ontarians do not have a workplace pension. There is a savings crisis, and we need to tackle it. New Democrats originally proposed a strong Made in Ontario plan. Unfortunately, what we're seeing this government do is slowly but surely limit the potential for a strong pension plan. To illustrate, initially, the Liberals said it would be a plan modelled after the CPP and designed so it could eventually be incorporated into the CPP. There was talk of universality, and then they started to talk about ways to exclude people. Comparable plans went from defined benefit plans to what we see them now trying to get away with as comparable and therefore excluded, PRPPs. Bank products similar to RRSPs that we've talked about in this legislature that don't even exist yet. They went from everyone in to a plan that could exclude seasonal workers, contract workers, and far too many precariously employed Ontarians. Now, Speaker, we're going to have much more opportunity to debate and discuss the design of the ORPP. But here's what I wanted to highlight today. On page 151 of this budget, they have laid out a section called Collaboration on a National Pension Solution. It says, Ontario will work collaboratively and intensively with the federal government, provinces and territories to make progress on a CPP enhancement that addresses the needs of future retirees. Okay. Apparently, it's the province's view that a CPP enhancement must be timely and provide a level of adequacy and targeted coverage that is consistent with the ORPP. So again, this government's view is that a CPP enhancement must provide targeted coverage that is consistent with the ORPP. Pardon? They started this ORPP journey by saying that the ORPP would be modelled after the CPP and be designed to be incorporated into the CPP. Now they're saying it is, in their view, that the CPP enhancement must provide targeted coverage consistent with the ORPP. Now they're saying CPP enhancement should be modelled after the ORPP. They've switched. I'd like to point out that CPP is a universal program for all. Universal, for all, not targeted. Targeted would indicate, again, that some will be excluded. For expansion to be targeted instead of universal, it would have to be designed differently. And creating a two-tiered CPP expansion is wrong and attacks one of Canada's universal cornerstones. Speaker, I'm almost out of time. And there's so much more that is missing from this budget. This government loves to forget about farmers, as we've heard, about our northerners, and anyone who needs affordable housing. The environment, too, has been laid out as a weak priority. In remarks from one of my colleagues earlier in debate, it was referred to as photo-op environmentalism. That stuck with me because that's just so well phrased. Photo-op environmentalism. We will see a 5-cent increase in gasoline, but why won't we see that money go to green initiatives instead of into Liberal pockets? I guess for that to happen, they'd have to want to make a difference, not just to make noise and not just make things worse. To summarize, Mr. Speaker, I do not support this government or its short-sighted, shallow, rush budget, quite simply because this government does not support our communities. And it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, if they're not supporting our communities, who are they supporting? Thank you.